In the summer of 1880, Ashwick County, North Carolina, seemed untouched by the turbulence of the wider world. It was a place where the air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia and cotton, where the streets remained quiet long after sundown, and where women wore white gloves to church even when the heat boiled the air. The genteel women of Ashwick's sewing circle were the jewel of that small society. They met every Thursday afternoon in the Whitford parlor, a wide room with sunlight spilling through lace curtains, the air smelling faintly of lavender water and starch. To the townspeople it was a harmless gathering, a place where charitable quilts were stitched for the orphanage and wedding gowns were sewn for the county's daughters. Yet beneath that polished surface something colder pulsed, something that had taken root so deeply that no one thought to question it. The circle was led by Mrs. Eugenia Whitford, cousin to First Lady Lucy Webb Hayes, a woman whose posture never bent and whose hands never trembled, not even when she held a needle so thin it could split a hair. Her reputation was one of poise and refinement, her home a place where every clock ran in perfect harmony and every chair was placed at the exact same angle. It was here that the women gathered, their voices low, their movements practiced. The Whitford parlor had a way of swallowing sound, so that even the smallest cough seemed muffled. In that silence, Eugenia worked not only with fabric, but with minds. Her compliments came sparingly, her corrections with a tone that made a grown woman feel like a chastised child. The first change was so small no one saw it. The meetings grew longer, the air heavier. Patterns became more elaborate, each stitch following Eugenia's diagrams precisely. Diagrams that called for stitches so fine they cut into the fingertips until the women's skin cracked. At first it was only discomfort. Soon it was pain. They were instructed to prick themselves deliberately to teach patience, dipping the needle point into a small porcelain dish of something Eugenia called linen wax, which smelled faintly of bitter almonds. The stings lingered, reddening the skin. She told them it made the hands steadier. None of them asked what was in the wax. Weeks turned to months, and the sewing circle's projects shifted. Quilts and gowns became secondary to the creation of small dolls, each no bigger than a newborn. The dolls' faces were stitched with black thread, their eyes formed from tight knots that looked almost burnt into place. Every member was required to make one, starting with fabric given only by Eugenia. She said it was from her family's storerooms, old but strong. The fabric was yellowed with a faint brown shadow that no amount of washing could lift. When the women stitched the dolls, they found the cloth sometimes frayed in strange ways, almost as if it resisted being sewn. The changes in the women were gradual but visible. They became thinner, paler, their hands marked by dozens of tiny healing wounds. Some began speaking less to their husbands, preferring the quiet of the sewing table. A few stopped attending church altogether, saying they were too tired. Those who voiced discomfort with the work found themselves the subject of Eugenia's calm but penetrating attention. She would place her hand on theirs, press the needle between their fingers, and guide the stitch herself until they were trembling, promising to keep up. They always returned the next week. One hot August evening, the town awoke to news that the sewing circle would not meet again. The Whitford parlor was locked, its curtains drawn tight. By the next morning, whispers swept through the streets. All 18 women had been found lifeless, each seated upright in her own chair in the parlor, hands folded over a doll identical to the others. Hand-stitched black thread eyes staring upward. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned teacups or scattered fabric. Every face was serene, as though they had merely fallen asleep mid-task. But under the calm lay a detail that the coroner would not share in full until years later. Each woman's palms and fingers were riddled with punctures that had bled slowly before death, the wounds precise enough to have been made with a sewing needle. The blood loss was subtle, stretched over hours, the pain dulled enough to keep them from panic but never fully absent. It was death by 1,000 tiny injuries, methodical and deliberate, their bodies drained as the dolls in their hands were completed. For the coroner, the discovery was worse still. Inside each doll's stuffing were strands of the woman's own hair, tightly wound around something small and hard. Some were stones, others pieces of bone, the kind only found in the tiniest of human skulls. No one could say where they came from, but the cemetery behind the Whitford home had fresh earth in places where no burial was recorded. It was as if each woman had been made to stitch herself into her own effigy, binding her final moments into the shape of a child she could never hold again. Eugenia herself was not among the dead. She was found in an upstairs room, seated at her writing desk, her dress immaculate. The needles she had used lay neatly aligned in a silver tray. When questioned, she claimed the women had been part of a spiritual correction to prepare them for a higher purpose. She spoke of patience, discipline, and the purification of grief through steady, controlled suffering. There was no confession in her tone, only a cold conviction, as if the deaths were not tragedies but the completion of a design. The authorities could not prove murder. The official cause of death remained unknown ailment, and the matter was quietly closed. In Ashwick County, people would later say the women of the sewing circle had simply worked themselves to exhaustion. But the black-eyed dolls, now sealed in evidence boxes, told another story, one stitched slowly, precisely, and without mercy. And though the sewing circle was gone, Eugenia Whitford remained, her Thursday afternoon suddenly free, but her needles still sharp. The next gathering would come in time, and Ashwick would not notice until it was too late. The Whitford home had always been a place of measured perfection. Every curtain hem hung at the exact same height, every vase of lilies replaced before the petals dared to brown. But behind this symmetry lay a single locked door on the second floor, one that even the most trusted housemaids were never allowed to open. It was this door, pried apart during the investigation, that revealed the truth about what had happened to the sewing circle. Inside was no cloth, no silks or cottons, but a shallow cabinet lined with neat drawers, each labeled in Mrs. Whitford's precise script. The first drawer opened to reveal paper patterns, not for dresses but for human bodies. Each sheet bore a woman's name written in small, deliberate ink. On these fragile patterns, pins had been driven through specific points, the same places where investigators would later discover puncture wounds on the corpses. It was as if each woman had been reduced to a garment template, her anatomy mapped like fabric to be cut and altered according to Eugenia's design. The pins were not random. They followed a meticulous order, clustering along nerve pathways and blood vessels. the kind of knowledge only a mind obsessed with both medicine and cruelty could possess. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that these patterns mirrored the methods of Dr. J. Marion Sims, whose experimental surgeries on women had been both celebrated and reviled. Eugenia had taken this medical legacy and fused it with something older, something pulled from an obscure French text investigators found in the bottom drawer. A work on needle therapy that claimed to influence the organs through the skin, using pain to adjust the body's hidden rhythms. The passages were underlined in faint pencil, with notes in the margins connecting each point of entry to an organ, a muscle, a pulse. Eugenia's annotations were not the notes of a healer. They were the calculations of a tailor fitting a body not for clothing but for its final moment. In the cabinet's deepest drawer, wrapped in waxed paper, they found the remnants of what Eugenia called the final garments. These were lengths of coarse linen, stiffened and stained, with stitching so tight it puckered the fabric into ridges. Each strip bore traces of human tissue fused into the thread. Forensic examination revealed what the naked eye could not miss. These garments had been sewn directly into the victim's flesh, pulled tight enough to collapse veins, starving parts of the body of blood. The result was a slow suffocation of the limbs, the skin paling, then darkening as the tissue began to die. This process was not quick. It could take hours, sometimes days, during which the victim would feel a creeping numbness followed by deep, unrelenting ache. The women of the sewing circle had been made to wear these garments beneath their clothes, concealed under layers of respectable cotton and lace. The method was as much about the mind as the body. The pressure was constant, inescapable. As the stitches bit deeper, their movements slowed, their thoughts dulled, and they began to speak less at meetings. By the time they were seated in the Whitford parlor for the final gathering, many could barely feel their hands, yet Eugenia placed a needle between their fingers and told them to continue sewing. Every stitch they made bled them a little more, the veins already narrowed by the linen strangling them from within. It was not enough for Eugenia to kill. She wanted to shape their deaths as she shaped her patterns, to perfect the act of unmaking a human being. The cabinet showed the progression, early diagrams with only a few pins, later patterns crowded with dozens, refined until each death was predictable down to the hour. This was not the work of someone seeking chaos. It was the work of a mind seeking mastery over suffering. In her notes, beside one woman's name, she had written "perfect closure." Beside another, "veins compliant." The language was cold, as if she were assessing the fit of a bodice rather than the ruin of a living body. What disturbed the investigators most was the way Eugenia's life outside the cabinet had never betrayed its existence. She hosted luncheons, wrote letters to her cousin in the White House, and sent flowers to the families of the very women she was dismantling. To neighbors, she was the embodiment of refinement. To the women who died beneath her stitches, she was something closer to an architect of their bodies' undoing, a seamstress of mortality. In the days after the cabinet was opened, word spread quietly through Ashwick County. Some whispered that the cabinet had been built decades earlier during the war, when Eugenia's father, a plantation doctor, experimented on those he owned, using similar patterns to train the flesh. Others claimed the French text had been a gift from a traveling physician who had stayed at the Whitford estate for a season, bringing with him both foreign techniques and a taste for the macabre. No one could agree on how long Eugenia had been working from those patterns, but the seamless precision of her methods left no doubt that this was not her first set of deaths. The cabinet was removed from the house under heavy guard, its contents sealed in crates. But even then the drawers rattled faintly as they were carried out, pins shifting in their paper hosts as though disturbed by the light. The sheriff ordered it locked away, never to be displayed, yet everyone who saw it agreed. It was not an artifact to be buried in evidence. It was a blueprint, and like all blueprints, it could be built again. Eugenia remained calm through it all, sitting in her parlor as if she were merely waiting for her next guests. When asked about the cabinet, she smiled faintly and said it was a record of good work. To her, there had been nothing criminal in what she had done, only the satisfaction of seeing her designs brought to completion. The deaths had not been accidents. They had been executions sewn into the very fabric of her victims' lives, each one carried out with the same cold patience she used to thread her needles. And somewhere in the quiet of that house, she knew there were still patterns left unfinished. The dolls were the first thing anyone noticed when the bodies were found. 18 women sitting in their chairs as though still mid-conversation, each holding a small hand-stitched figure in her lap. At first glance, they seemed like harmless toys, fabric faces, black thread eyes, tiny limbs stuffed with cotton. But when the coroner's knife cut through the first one, the illusion unraveled. Beneath the stitched cloth face was a hollow cavity lined not with wool or sawdust, but with slivers of bone, smoothed to fit together like a crude mosaic. The bone was unmistakable to those trained to recognize it. The delicate curve of an infant's skull, too small to have come from any child who had walked or spoken. The samples were taken quietly to the state laboratory, where further examination confirmed the worst. The bone fragments had not been acquired by accident. They matched remains from unmarked graves in the Whitford family cemetery, earth so recently turned that some fragments still carried traces of soil and root. Most of the graves had no markers, only the faint depressions that came with years of neglect. Records suggested they belonged to the children of enslaved women who had lived on the Whitford estate before the war. Yet their presence in these dolls told a deeper, more deliberate story, one that began decades before the sewing circle ever met. Eugenia's father, Dr. Charles Whitford, had been a plantation doctor during the Civil War, a man known for his quiet authority and an unsettling tendency to experiment. Survivors from those years long since scattered spoke in whispers of comfort objects he had given his patients before surgery. Crude dolls made from scraps of fabric, often scented with herbs or oils. They were meant to calm, to occupy the mind while he performed procedures without anesthesia, claiming the mind could be tricked into compliance if the hands were kept busy. But those objects, too, were said to have carried something inside them. Small, hard tokens that rattled faintly if shaken. No one then had dared to cut one open. Eugenia had taken her father's technique and refined it. The dolls she made for the sewing circle were not simply tokens of membership, they were instruments of control, designed to bind the women to her through touch and scent. In each doll, the bone lining was thin enough to flex when pressed, creating a faint, unnatural give under the fabric. Just enough for the holder to notice, just enough to keep the mind returning to the sensation. Mixed into the stuffing was a fine powder of embalming salts, its sharp chemical scent masked beneath a layer of lavender oil. The salts were slow to release, activated by the warmth of the hands that held them. Over hours, the victims inhaled small doses, not enough to kill outright, but enough to cause dizziness, shallow breathing, and a strange, lethargic calm. The effect was deliberate. The women grew accustomed to holding the dolls for long stretches, cradling them as they stitched, pressing their faces close without realizing they were breathing in something that dulled resistance. On the final day, as the linen garments Eugenia had sewn into their skin tightened and their blood thinned, the scent worked in tandem with the physical torment, leaving them too weakened to rise, too fogged to speak above a whisper. It was not just their bodies that were trapped. Their minds were caught in a haze, lulled by the same tools her father had once used to still the movements of his unwilling patients. The bone fragments themselves were more than a material choice. To Eugenia, they were part of a private ritual. She selected pieces from graves with care, polishing them until they were smooth enough to handle without tearing the cloth. Each doll was lined with bone from a single grave, and each victim was assigned one that, in Eugenia's mind, matched her temperament. She kept notes on these pairings in a ledger found later in her desk, entries like Martha L., docile, paired with infant number 14, and Clara W., prone to complaint, given bone with crown fracture. To her, the connection between the dead and the living was a thread to be sewn shut. She believed that binding a woman to the remains of an infant made her softer, less able to resist correction, as one chilling line in her handwriting declared. The investigators who examined the dolls struggled to put into words the feeling that crept over them as they handled the objects. The fabric was faintly damp, as though it held some trace of the final moments in the Whitford parlor. The black thread eyes were too tight, the knots pulled so hard they puckered the cloth, and beneath that, always the whisper of bone when the doll shifted in the hand. One examiner reported an overpowering urge to set the doll down after only minutes, describing a sensation of breathlessness that lingered for hours afterward. It became clear that the dolls were as much a part of the killings as the physical stitching of the garments. They were the anchor, the thing each woman clung to as her body failed. Even in death, their hands remained curled around them, knuckles pale against the fabric. The coroner concluded that the combination of poison inhalation, blood loss, and circulatory collapse had been timed to align. A threefold attack on body and mind, orchestrated with the precision of someone who viewed life as something to be cut, shaped, and finished. When word spread about the bone fragments, families of the victims demanded the dolls be burned, but the sheriff refused, locking them away in the evidence vault, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps out of a desire to preserve proof of what had been done. To this day, they remain there wrapped in cloth, their hollow skulls intact. The embalming scent has faded, but those who have handled them claim that when the air is still enough, the smell returns for just a moment. Sharp, chemical and final, like the last breath drawn in a room where the curtains have already been closed. And in that quiet, one could almost imagine Eugenia's hands at work again, threading the needle, stitching the past into the living. Certain that no one else would ever understand the beauty she saw and the suffering she created. The truth lay not only in the faces of the dead, but in the skin beneath their fine dresses. When the bodies of the sewing circle were brought into the dim, chilled room of the county coroner, it was the smallest marks that told the most. Along each torso and arm ran faint, deliberate stitch lines, barely raised, almost beautiful in their symmetry. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like decorative welts, the after effects of some rash or skin irritation. But when the skin was opened, the reality became clear. These were not surface wounds at all, but embroidery from within. Thread had been drawn through the subdermal layers, looped in patterns that tightened and held, binding muscle to muscle, nerve to nerve. It was as if the body itself had been sewn shut from the inside. The thread was dark, almost black, but when ground and tested, it revealed the rich, bruised hue of crushed nightshade berries. This was not mere dye. It was a slow poison. As the stitches held their place beneath the skin, the poison bled into the body, drop by drop, each movement of the victim's arm or chest forcing it deeper into the bloodstream. The first symptoms would have been subtle. A tingling in the fingers, a strange weakness in the legs, a sluggish heaviness of the tongue. Hours later, breathing would grow shallow, the chest muscles tightening as though laced, and still the victim would remain awake, aware, able to feel the steady pull of thread beneath her skin with every breath she tried to take. Eugenia Whitford had not invented the technique. Somewhere among the dust and decay of her family's archives, historians would later find a slim hand-bound volume in French, its pages stained with use. In it, an obscure entry described a punishment used in 17th century France against women who betrayed their bloodline. The process was called closing the body to sin, a ritual in which the flesh was embroidered to restrict movement and bleed the spirit of its rebellion. It was meant to be symbolic, a sealing away of the offender's will. But Eugenia had adapted it, discarding the ritual's theatrics for a cleaner, more clinical execution. She had married the symbolism of moral correction to the cold logic of medical control, ensuring that the physical effects could not be reversed once begun. The pattern of stitches on each victim was different, yet all served the same purpose: to immobilize without immediately killing. Some women had their upper arms bound from the inside, the thread locking the biceps to the chest so that even raising a hand became impossible. Others had stitches woven through the rib muscles, each breath pulling against a poison-laced loop until the pain discouraged further attempts. The cruelty was not in speed but in pacing. It allowed the victim to feel every stage of her decline, the weakening limbs, the breath that came shorter and shorter, the mind clear enough to know exactly what was happening. These embroidered wounds told a story not just of physical torture but of psychological mastery. To carry such thread work beneath the skin was to carry a constant awareness of one's own helplessness. The body itself became a cage, and every attempt to move confirmed the futility of escape. The women of the sewing circle had been made to live in these cages for days before their deaths, attending gatherings, stitching with trembling hands while their bodies slowly betrayed them. It was not simply about ending life. It was about reshaping it, bending it until resistance collapsed under its own weight. In some cases, the embroidery followed decorative patterns, curling loops along the forearms, latticed designs across the abdomen, as though Eugenia sought to leave her signature inside the flesh. To the coroner, these designs were horrifying in their beauty, like the work of an artist who saw no distinction between creation and destruction. It was as though she had been dressing her victims for a final display only she would witness. The use of nightshade made the designs fade from view after death, the swelling subsiding so that only faint scars remained, almost invisible to those who did not know where to look. This too was deliberate, a way to hide the evidence in plain sight. The investigators who pieced this together came to understand that the embroidery was not random, nor was it purely for the sake of cruelty. It was a test. Each victim's tolerance was measured in thread and toxin, adjusted with precision. One woman's pattern showed heavier stitching near the diaphragm, likely meant to hasten breathlessness. Another's focused on the hands and arms, perhaps to watch how long she could still sew before the paralysis became complete. These were experiments, and each death provided data for the next. For the women who endured it, the mind's breaking point came long before the bodies. The knowledge that the thread lay just beneath their skin, hidden where no one could see, created a private terror. They could not prove their suffering to others. They could only feel it, the tightening, the sting, the warmth of poison spreading outward. This was how Eugenia kept control. She made their pain invisible, a secret carried in the flesh until it became their only truth. When the last autopsy was complete, the coroner laid out the evidence on a single table. Coils of dark thread, fragments of stained tissue, sketches of the stitch patterns recovered from beneath the skin. The sight was enough to still the room. These were not tools of mercy, nor the work of a healer. They were the marks of someone who believed that control must be complete to be meaningful, that the body could be remade in service of obedience. And somewhere in the shadow of that truth was the chilling certainty that Eugenia had perfected the method long before the sewing circle began. The embroidery of pain was not just a way to kill, it was a way to own. And in Ashwick County, the women who had carried those hidden stitches to their graves had become part of a design that would never be fully erased. By the time the women arrived at the Whitford parlor for what would be their final meeting, the air outside was heavy with the damp heat of late summer. The curtains had been drawn, muting the daylight to a dim amber that seemed to press against the walls. Eugenia had sent her instructions days earlier, handwritten in her looping script. Each woman was to bring a swatch of fabric taken from a cradle she no longer owned. The request was simple on paper, but in practice it reached into the softest, most unguarded parts of them. Some carried scraps faded to near white from decades of folding and refolding. Others clutched bright threads worn soft with the weight of memory. They were tokens of children lost to fever, to stillbirth, to winters too cold for a body to survive. They arrived with the cloth wrapped in handkerchiefs or tucked into the lining of their purses, holding them as one might hold a photograph too precious to expose to light for long. Eugenia greeted them as always with a smile that did not touch her eyes and a voice that moved with unhurried precision. She poured tea herself, a courtesy that made the women feel tended to, though none of them noticed the faint glisten of tincture swirling beneath the surface. The blend dulled the tongue and throat, making speech effortful, while sharpening the sense of hearing so that every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of a chair leg, the whisper of thread drawn through cloth, the creak of Eugenia's own shoes as she moved among them. Once they had drunk, she directed them to take their seats in the oval formation she always favored, placing herself at the head like the conductor of an orchestra only she could hear. The ritual began without fanfare. A doll was placed in each woman's lap, identical in form yet heavy for its size. The hollow beneath the stitched cloth face gave slightly when pressed, the bone lining hidden within flexing almost imperceptibly. Eugenia instructed them to take out their swatches and stitch them into the doll's belly, sewing slowly, carefully, as though mending something far older than fabric. With the tincture coursing through them, their hands trembled but their focus sharpened, the sound of needles slipping in and out of cloth taking on a hypnotic rhythm. The act was binding in more than one sense, their grief sewn into an object they could neither refuse nor put aside. As the work continued, Eugenia opened the Whitford family's Book of Domestic Order. Bound in worn leather and smelling faintly of mildew and medicinal herbs, it was a strange hybrid of Methodist scripture and medical instruction. Each passage was a pairing, a verse on obedience or purity followed by a description of some procedure meant to enforce it. She read aloud with the same even tone she might use to explain a household chore, speaking of correcting the errant body and sealing the spirit against the return of vice. Her words slid over the room like a slow tide, filling the air between the women until it seemed that even the act of breathing had to follow her cadence. The stitching grew more difficult as the dolls' bellies filled. The bone lining resisted the needle, forcing the women to push harder, drawing the thread with a pressure that sent a tremor through their arms. For some, the embroidered nightshade thread Eugenia had introduced in earlier weeks was still laced beneath their own skin, making each motion ache. But no one stopped. The tincture muted their instinct to pull away, making the pain feel distant, almost justified. Around the room, the women's eyes began to glaze, their shoulders rounding inward as though they were folding into the work itself. At intervals, Eugenia moved behind them, placing a hand lightly on a shoulder or leaning close to inspect a stitch. Her touch was soft, almost maternal, but her eyes flicked to the patterns with a surgeon's precision, noting how each woman's breath caught, how her fingers twitched or stilled. She spoke sparingly, praising neat stitches, reminding them that this was the closing of the cradle, a necessary act to keep what had been lost from haunting the living. The words carried both comfort and finality, a logic that felt unshakable in the room's heavy air. By the time the last swatch was sewn into place, the tea had done its deeper work. Their limbs felt weighted, their voices reduced to faint murmurs if they spoke at all. Eugenia closed the Book of Domestic Order and set it aside, instructing them to hold the dolls close, to press their cheeks against the cloth and breathe. The embalming salts hidden in the stuffing released more sharply now, the lavender oil masking just enough of the acrid undertone to keep them from recoiling. The chemical vapors slid into their lungs, pairing with the slow poison already in their blood from weeks of embroidered thread. Breathing became a deliberate act, each inhalation making the body heavier, the mind quieter. Eugenia's final act was not a flourish, but a stillness. She returned to her seat at the head of the oval, folding her hands in her lap, watching as the women sat in their places, the dolls cradled against them. There was no panic, no attempt to rise. The room was filled with the faint sound of breath. Slow, shallow, synchronized, as though they had all been brought into the same rhythm. To an outsider, it might have looked like the end of an ordinary meeting, the women simply resting before they took their leave. But for Eugenia, it was the moment her design reached its perfect completion. Each woman was bound in 3 ways: by the doll in her lap, by the poison in her veins, and by the silence she could no longer break. No one saw them die, but by morning all 18 were found exactly as they had been left, seated, composed, hands folded over the dolls, stitched with their own grief. And in the quiet parlor, the book of domestic order remained open to a page marked in Eugenia's careful hand, its passage underlined in faded ink. The home must be kept in order and the body made obedient to its keeper. Eleanor Wainwright had never belonged in the Whitford parlor. She was younger than most of the circle, her clothes newer, her manner brighter. Her invitation had been extended not out of friendship but out of strategy. Her husband's brother, Governor Thomas Jarvis, believed that seating her among Ashwick's most respected women would lend him an air of domestic virtue in the coming election. Eleanor had accepted with the eager compliance of someone eager to be useful, unaware that she was walking into a tradition that consumed those it embraced. To the other women she was an outsider. To Eugenia Whitford she was an opportunity. On the morning of the final gathering, Eleanor arrived with her cradle swatch folded into a neat square. Unlike the others, hers was bright cream, untouched by time. The child it once belonged to had been lost only months before, to a sudden fever that burned through the night and left her holding a body that was still warm when it was lowered into the ground. She had not yet grown used to the absence, and Eugenia saw that absence the way a hawk sees the quiver of a rabbit's flank. An opening. As the meeting progressed, Eugenia watched her more than the others, noting the stiffness of her posture, the way her eyes glistened when her hand brushed the fabric. When Eleanor's body was found among the rest the next morning, it was clear she had been marked apart. The doll in her lap was heavier than the others, the stitching more deliberate. When it was cut open, the coroner found no cotton inside. Instead, the belly was packed with Eleanor's own hair, cut in long, silken lengths and knotted around a small bundle of bone fragments. The hair was clean, the knots tight, the arrangement purposeful. It was as if Eugenia had taken the last piece of Eleanor's living body that could be handled and bound it into the doll, making her both the mourner and the memorial. It was an intimacy that chilled the investigators, for it meant that at some point in the hours before her death, Eleanor's hair had been cut, an act that required her stillness and compliance, whether willing or not. Governor Jarvis received the news with the measured composure of a man accustomed to political storms. But behind the closed doors of the governor's residence, he raged at the implications. To have his sister-in-law die in the company of a group already whispering with suspicion was dangerous enough. To have her name tied to rumors of ritualized death was unthinkable. His first command was that the cause of death be altered on the record. The word consumption was entered into the official ledger, a tidy explanation that fit the image of a delicate woman fading from illness rather than one drained by methodical cruelty. There would be no public autopsy, no mention of the doll, and certainly no discussion of the hair inside it. Yet Jarvis was no fool. He understood that removing suspicion required more than rewriting a cause of death. Within days, he issued a quiet order to seal the Whitford estate. The parlor where the women had sat, the cabinet where patterns had been stored, the upstairs room where Eugenia wrote her notes, all were to be locked, their contents inventoried and removed under guard. But the governor's control, like all political control, was imperfect. Before the locks were turned, Eugenia's personal physician, Dr. Elias Greer, was granted entry under the pretext of securing her private medical papers. Greer was a man as precise and calculating as Eugenia herself, a long-time confidant who had been present in her household for years, treating minor ailments and serving as an unspoken witness to her work. On that day, he emerged from the house with several heavy locked chests, each marked with her initials. The guards did not question him. Their instructions were to preserve dignity, and the physician's presence was taken as part of that duty. No one knew then what the chests contained, only that they were never seen again. Later, whispers suggested they held what Eugenia called her teaching material, not just the diagrams and anatomical sketches already known, but the preserved remains of earlier experiments, patterns refined over decades, tools adapted for work the public would not understand. Some said they contained dolls from before the sewing circle, each with its own strange weight, its own hidden contents. Others believed they held ledgers more damning than any corpse, pages where Eugenia had recorded the precise measurements of suffering. How long a woman could endure a particular stitch before losing consciousness, how many breaths remained once the nightshade thread began to work. The sealing of the estate was swift, but it was not final. Eugenia remained within its walls, her movements restricted but her composure unbroken. Jarvis had no interest in a trial. Trials left records, and records could be read decades later. Instead, she became a kind of ghost in plain sight, the parlor abandoned but the woman still present, moving through rooms that smelled faintly of lavender and embalming salts. The official story was that she was unwell, overcome with grief for the friends she had lost, though no one in Ashwick ever claimed to have seen her cry. For the families of the dead, Eleanor's inclusion among them was a bitter irony. She had been meant to elevate the circle's standing, to connect it to the highest office in the state. Instead, her presence bound it to power in a darker way. Her death ensured silence. No one would challenge the governor's version of events, not when he could make livelihoods vanish with a word. The women's names faded from public conversation, their absence explained away in polite terms, their graves unmarked or simply folded into existing family plots. Yet the doll filled with Eleanor's hair was never destroyed. It was kept in the coroner's evidence room, sealed in a box, the hair still bound around the hidden bones. Those who handled it claimed the strands seemed too clean, too new, as though time had not touched them. And some swore that when the box was opened, a faint smell of tea and lavender would rise. The scent of that final gathering, preserved like the work of a hand that believed death was not an end, but a form of keeping. The governor's intervention had ended public scrutiny, but it had not erased the truth. It had only locked it away, just as the estate was locked, just as the chests were carried out under the watch of a physician whose loyalty was to something older and more enduring than the law. Eugenia's design had claimed its most influential victim, and in doing so had ensured that no one with the power to stop her would dare to speak. The silence, like the stitches she favored, was pulled tight and left to hold. The storm that summer was the kind that seemed intent on uncovering things meant to stay buried. Rain fell for 3 days without pause, swelling the Ashwick River until its banks broke and sent water rushing into the lowlands. The old Whitford estate, abandoned for decades and left to rot behind locked gates, sat high enough to escape the worst of the flooding. But the outbuildings and the root cellar beneath them were not so fortunate. When the waters receded, they left behind more than mud. Half submerged in the silt and debris were several heavy oak chests, their iron fittings rusted but their locks still clinging stubbornly to their hasps. A work crew tasked with clearing the wreckage recognized the initials carved into the wood. E.W. They belonged to Eugenia Whitford. The decision to open the chests was not made lightly. They had been sealed by the governor's order almost half a century earlier, and the air around them seemed to carry an unspoken warning. But curiosity in Ashwick had always been stronger than fear, and when the first lock was cut, the stench that rose made every man step back. Inside, neatly arranged on black felt, were wax models of human torsos. Each was sculpted with unnerving accuracy, from the subtle ridges of the ribs to the delicate blue tracing of veins. But where the skin should have been smooth, there were stitches. Not crude or ragged, but deliberate, intricate patterns sewn with darkened thread. Some stitches formed tight, spiraled knots over imagined nerve points. Others ran in long, unbroken lines, pulling the wax into puckered folds. Every model bore a paper tag tied to its wrist, the name written in the same precise, slanted script. In the second chest, the contents were not wax. Rows of glass jars stood in sawdust-lined compartments, each holding a preserved organ floating in yellowed fluid. The hearts, livers, and lungs were labeled with the same women's names that appeared in old Whitford social records. Women long buried, their deaths unremarkable on paper but now suddenly suspect. Some organs had stitch marks running across them, the sutures still intact despite the decades. Others bore small burns, precise incisions, or strange symmetrical cuts that matched diagrams later found in Eugenia's medical notebooks. To those who studied them, it was clear these were not remnants of failed surgeries. They were records of controlled experiments kept not for healing but for reference. Trophies of a mind that measured life in degrees of manipulation. The third chest was unlike the others. When its lid was lifted, it revealed nothing but dolls, hundreds of them stacked with unnatural care, each wrapped in muslin and tied with ribbon. Their faces were blank, stitched without mouths, their bodies soft and yielding. Every doll had a name tag pinned to its chest. Some were dated in the 1880s, others as far back as the 1840s, long before Eugenia's time at the center of the sewing circle. Many of those earlier names belonged to women who had died on the Whitford plantation, their graves unmarked, their histories unrecorded except here in fabric effigies. The dolls were lighter than the ones found with the sewing circle victims, but when cut open, a few were found to hold shards of something harder than cloth. Brittle flakes of bone, tiny teeth, fragments of what might once have been fingernails. It was the notebooks found beneath the dolls that connected the chest's contents to an even older legacy. Bound in leather and worn thin at the edges, they contained anatomical sketches paired with a strange, almost poetic set of instructions. These were not Eugenia's notes, but her mother's. Her handwriting was looser, but the intent was the same: to chart the body not as a vessel of health, but as a structure to be altered. One passage described the whisper stitch, a method of sewing into nerve clusters with thread coated in an oil distilled from poisonous plants. The stitch, once tightened, sent the victim into a state of induced visions, hallucinations vivid enough to replace reality for hours or days. The purpose, according to the notes, was not to kill, but to prepare the mind for correction, to weaken its certainty until the subject would accept whatever truth was placed before them. Eugenia had not invented her cruelty, she had inherited it. In the margins of her mother's work, she had written her own refinements, altering the placement of stitches, adjusting the dosage of oil, noting which victims became docile and which became frantic. She wrote of her belief that the mind could be remade through this process, stripped of its defenses and reshaped like fabric over a form. It was a philosophy as much as it was a method, a conviction that suffering was not only a means to an end, but an art in itself. The historians who examined the chests realized they were holding the archive of a generational practice, a private system of torture disguised as care, passed from mother to daughter and perfected over decades. The women whose names were written on those tags had not died randomly. Each had been chosen, tested, altered, and finally preserved, whether as wax, as flesh, or as cloth. The chests were not the remnants of one woman's crimes. They were the family's true inheritance, hidden away to survive beyond the reach of scandal or law. When the last chest was closed, the air in the room seemed heavier, as though the objects within still held the echo of every breath they had stolen. The archivists who documented the find argued over what to do next: destroy the contents or keep them sealed as evidence of the truth. In the end, the decision was delayed. The chests were moved to a secure state facility, their locks replaced, their keys kept by men who would never speak of them in public. But those who had seen inside could not forget. They knew that what had been found was not simply a record of the past, but a set of instructions waiting for hands willing to follow them. And somewhere, in the waterlogged silence of the Whitford ruins, it seemed possible that more chests still lay buried, waiting for another flood, another moment when the earth would give up what it had been told to keep. The Whitford family cemetery sat at the far edge of the estate, hidden behind a wall of ancient cedar trees whose roots had long since broken the stone boundary. It was a place few dared to walk, even in daylight. Official records accounted for only 18 members of the sewing circle, their names etched neatly into county ledgers. But the ground told another story. Beneath its moss-covered mounds lay 42 unmarked graves, all dating from the 1870s and 1880s, a number that could not be explained by family deaths alone. The arrangement of the graves was precise, each plot aligned as though drawn from a single pattern, the spacing so exact it suggested deliberate planning. When the state exhumed several of the sites in the years after the flood exposed the chests, the evidence confirmed what whispers had long claimed. The remains were almost all women, many still bearing the fine traces of Eugenia's craft. Bone analysis revealed threads of cotton embedded deep in rib cages and collarbones, the fibers too tightly bound to be explained by shrouds or burial garments. These threads had been placed there in life, sewn through tissue with such precision that they became part of the skeleton itself. The stitching was identical to the patterns documented in the wax models and preserved organs found in the chests. It was unmistakable. These women had been altered, corrected in the same way as the sewing circle victims, their bodies turned into quiet records of her work. Locals had their own version of the truth, one that had persisted for decades in low-voiced warnings passed between mothers and daughters. Women who questioned the sewing circle's teaching, who stopped attending meetings, who challenged Eugenia's instructions, who simply refused to complete a project she had assigned, would grow ill. The sickness came without warning, often beginning as a stiffness in the shoulders or a weakness in the hands. It deepened over days into a strange paralysis, the body folding inward until movement became agony. The victim would vanish from public view, her absence explained by whispered claims of a sudden move to care for distant relatives, or an extended stay in some unnamed sanatorium. Within weeks, a night burial would take place in the Whitford Cemetery. The burials themselves were conducted without ceremony, always under the cover of darkness. The only witnesses were members of the Whitford household and their long-serving physician, Dr. Elias Greer. He was there for each one, his tall frame unmistakable in the lamplight, standing beside the open grave as though supervising the final stage of some complex treatment. His journal, discovered after his death, revealed that he did not see these burials as disposal but as the completion of a process. He wrote of correcting the flesh so the spirit may breathe, of ensuring that the body carried no trace of rebellion into the next life. His notes described a quiet satisfaction in seeing his patients lowered into the earth with their alterations intact, as though they were finished works freed from the imperfection of their former selves. To Greer and Eugenia, death was not an interruption but the natural end to their design. Their work did not stop when the heart did. It was preserved in the bone, in the knots of thread still gripping the skeleton long after the flesh had gone. In some cases, the cotton fibers had fused with calcified bone, creating a permanent scar in the structure itself. These were not only graves. They were a library of methods, each body holding the record of a particular experiment in restraint, paralysis, or controlled decline. The cemetery was not a place of mourning. It was an archive. The psychological toll on the community was more subtle but no less enduring. The women who remained learned quickly that disobedience was not a matter of private consequence but of public survival. The sewing circle became less a gathering and more a test of loyalty, each meeting another chance to prove one's compliance under the sharp eye of Eugenia Whitford. The unmarked graves pressed on them in silence, a reminder that absence could be arranged without explanation. The act of sewing, once a communal comfort, became an act bound to dread. The sound of the needle pulling through cloth mirrored the imagined pull of thread through flesh. What made the unmarked burials most terrifying was the absence of grief. No one in Ashwick openly mourned the women who vanished. Families remained silent, neighbors accepted the given explanations, and the graves themselves were left unadorned. The absence of markers was not a neglect of care, it was deliberate. A marked grave could be remembered, an unmarked one could be forgotten. And forgetting was the truest protection for those still living under the shadow of the Whitford name. Even decades later, when the cemetery was catalogued, there was resistance to exhumation. Some feared disturbing the graves would invite something worse than scandal. Others simply wanted the past to remain buried. But the forensic work could not be undone once begun. With each skeleton uncovered, the same details emerged. Threads looping around joints, delicate stitches in the sternum, knots at the base of the skull where nerve clusters once lay. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were consistent, calculated, and sustained over years. Each victim's body bore evidence of methodical torment, and each burial was the quiet sealing of a perfected experiment. The last grave opened contained the remains of a young woman barely in her 20s, her bones light and unweathered compared to the others. The cotton thread inside her was whiter, less frayed, as though her death had come closer to the end of Eugenia's reign. Her burial was the same as the rest. No marker, no coffin, only the weight of earth pressed down over her as Dr. Greer looked on. His journal entry for that night was brief. Correction complete. No further adjustment needed. The Whitford Cemetery still stands, its cedars whispering in the wind, the ground uneven from the hidden rows beneath. The unmarked graves remain untouched now, though the soil shifts each winter, revealing faint outlines where the past still breathes. To those who know the history, the silence there is heavier than the stone walls surrounding it. A silence built on obedience, fear, and the understanding that for some, the final stitch was always meant to be made in the dark. For 4 decades, the Whitford estate had remained locked behind its gates, its reputation sinking into the soft soil of Ashwick County like the unmarked graves scattered on its grounds. Those who had known the truth aged into silence, and those who might have asked questions learned early that it was better not to. The sewing circle deaths became a thing that belonged to no one. Not to the families, not to the church, not to the state. They existed in the way a scar exists under clothing, hidden yet always present. It was only in 1921 when a young reformist historian named Charles Alden arrived in Ashwick to document the county's architectural heritage that the rot beneath the surface began to push upward. Alden had no connection to the Whitfords, no loyalty to the names etched into the county's history books. He was the kind of man who believed that truth was a public resource, not a family heirloom to be hidden. While combing through probate records in the courthouse, he noticed an unusual cluster of property transfers and medical certificates, all tied to women of the same social class, all dated within a narrow range of years. Their deaths were listed as consumption, wasting illness, or unspecified decline, but the sheer number of them was impossible to explain away as coincidence. His curiosity deepened when he found that nearly every death certificate bore the signature of Dr. Elias Greer. When Alden petitioned the state for access to the Whitford estate records, he met immediate resistance. County officials argued that the matter was ancient history and warned that disturbing it would only harm the reputations of good families. But Alden persisted, gathering testimonies from the few still alive who had attended the sewing circle or lived in its shadow. They spoke reluctantly, their words edged with fear even after so many years, describing women who had returned from the circle changed, quieter, slower, their hands shaking when they tried to work. Some lasted weeks before vanishing. Others never made it home. The petition reached Raleigh, and after months of pressure from progressive legislators, the state authorized an inquiry. What followed was a slow unsealing of a sealed room. The chests recovered after the flood, the preserved organs, the wax models, the dolls, all were entered into evidence. The cotton threads found in the exhumed graves were matched to those embedded in the preserved remains. The diagrams from the Whitford cabinet were compared to the injuries on the bodies. The conclusion was undeniable. These women had not died of illness, but from deliberate, methodical harm. The killings had been disguised as medical treatment, carried out under the authority of a respected household and its physician. Public outrage was immediate, though it came with a strange edge. The crimes had been committed long ago, their perpetrators dead or beyond the reach of prosecution. Eugenia herself had been buried decades earlier in the family plot, her headstone unremarkable, her name still appearing on plaques in the county courthouse and above the entrance to the Whitford Library. The revelation forced the state to act not in punishment but in prevention. New medical consent laws were passed requiring signed authorization for any procedure, no matter how minor. Small-town domestic medical societies, the gatherings that blended folk remedies with social activity, were outlawed entirely, a quiet acknowledgement that under the cover of civility such spaces could become places of untraceable harm. The Whitford name did not survive the scandal intact. In the months after the inquiry, crews removed it from public buildings, chiseling it from stone and replacing it with the names of benefactors untouched by suspicion. The library became the Ashwick Public. The courthouse plaque left a blank where her family's crest had been. In social circles, the Whitford lineage was spoken of in the past tense, as though its bloodline had ended with Eugenia herself. But there was one living heir, a niece, Margaret Whitford, who had been sent north as a young woman to live with distant relatives. Margaret never returned to Ashwick. Reports from the sanatorium in which she spent her final years described a woman withdrawn, prone to long silences and sudden fits of weeping. She never married, never bore children. When she died in 1924, her personal effects contained nothing of her family's legacy. No photographs, no letters, no mention of Eugenia. The death of Margaret closed the Whitford line quietly, without ceremony, just as so many of its victims had been laid into the earth without a name. For Alden, the victory was hollow. The laws had changed, the records corrected, but justice felt absent. He wrote in his notes that the true damage of the Whitford crimes was not in the number of bodies, but in the way those deaths had been accepted for so long. It was not just the killer who had shaped the silence, but the town that had chosen to live within it. The methods Eugenia had perfected, the slow torture, the binding of body and will, had not simply ended lives, they had altered the way people understood obedience, fear, and the price of resistance. Even with the legal reforms, the sense of unfinished business lingered. The Whitford estate remained abandoned, its locked gates rusting but unmoved. Those who passed it at night claimed to hear the faint sound of fabric tearing, or the soft pull of thread through cloth, as if the work had never truly stopped. In the end, the law had come late, too late to save the women whose bodies lay in the unmarked graves, too late to break the cycle while its architect still breathed. What it had done was ensure that her name, once spoken with respect, was now only ever whispered, followed by a silence heavy enough to feel like a warning. The last surviving doll from the Whitford sewing circle sits alone, sealed behind a pane of museum glass. Its size is modest, small enough to fit in the hands of a child. But the weight of its presence draws visitors in like a gravity they do not understand. Its face is stitched in coarse fabric, the black thread eyes pulled so tight they pucker the cloth, giving the faint impression of a squint or a glare depending on the angle of the light. The stitching along its seams is uneven in places, as though meant to mimic the imperfections of something alive. The belly bulges slightly, and though the museum's display offers no explanation, those who know the history understand what might be inside. Hair, bone, or a swatch of cloth from a cradle long empty. The museum calls it an artifact of an unfortunate chapter in rural medical history, a phrase so polished it removes the blood from the cloth. There is no mention on the plaque of the women who died with identical dolls clutched in their hands. No account of the slow precision with which their bodies were undone. Instead, the label focuses on the sociological curiosity of domestic medical societies and their intersection with women's craft. To the casual visitor, it might be easy to imagine the doll as no more than a relic of misguided tradition. But those who come for reasons other than curiosity, the descendants, the ones who still speak their grandmother's names only in hushed tones, see something else entirely. It is said that the scent of embalming salt still lingers near the display. Faint but distinct, hidden beneath the smell of varnished wood and climate control. Some visitors claim it is stronger when the room is quiet, when the shuffle of feet and the hum of voices die down, and only the sound of breath fills the space. Others speak of the way the black thread eyes seem to follow them as they move, their gaze fixed not on the glass but on the hands of the living, as though judging the steadiness of the fingers that might hold a needle. A few have turned away mid-visit, unable to explain the sudden pressure in their chest or the chill that crept into their fingertips. Among the items left at the base of the display case are small folded swatches of cloth, offerings from those whose families carry the weight of the Whitford name in reverse. Not as heirs, but as survivors. The cloths are often plain, sometimes frayed, sometimes still holding the faint scent of cedar chests where they were kept for decades. They are not labeled or cataloged by the museum, left instead to accumulate until staff quietly removes them. No one announces their arrival, but they return week after week, as steady as the passing of time. They are the quiet proof that memory is not the same as history. One is kept alive, the other is written down. The doll's survival is a strange kind of defiance. Of the hundreds that once existed, this one was not buried with its victim or locked away in the evidence vault. It passed through years of private hands before being donated anonymously, arriving at the museum without provenance but with an unshakable sense of authenticity. Experts confirmed the fabric, the stitching, even the faint residue of lavender oil mixed with the unmistakable chemical traces of embalming. That mixture alone was enough to tie it to the Whitford circle, for it was Eugenia's signature. The scent of care masking the breath of decay. The curators who prepared it for display admitted to an unease they could not name. One spoke of waking in the night with the sound of fabric tearing still ringing in her ears. Another refused to handle it without gloves, even when protocols did not require them. Over time, some staff began to request transfers away from the exhibit room, citing headaches or a sense of being watched. The museum does not acknowledge these reports, but the rotation schedule for staff in that wing changes more often than anywhere else in the building. For those who understand the full history, the doll is more than an artifact. It is a warning. Its presence behind glass does not erase the truth that it once sat in the lap of a dying woman, that its fabric was stitched while the poison in her blood slowed her hands, that its belly was filled with something meant to bind her to the very force ending her life. It is a physical remnant of how evil can wear the face of care, how it can be sewn into the very fabric of daily life without raising alarm until the final stitch is tied. The reflection it forces is uncomfortable because it is not confined to the past. The Whitford sewing circle was not born in isolation. It thrived because it hid behind the language of community, improvement, and healing. It survived because no one believed harm could come from something so familiar, so domesticated. And when the truth began to surface, it was delayed, softened, and repackaged until even its public acknowledgement removed the sting of what had been done. Standing before the glass, the question lingers, not in the plaque, not in the official guide, but in the air between the visitor and the doll. Could this happen again? Could something as methodical, as ritualized, as intimate in its cruelty take root in a place where no one would think to look? The answer is not as distant as comfort might demand. The tools change, the setting changes, but the principles remain the same. Control disguised as care, compliance disguised as choice, and the silence of those who see enough to suspect but not enough to act. As the lights dim in the museum at closing time, the doll remains in its glass case, its black thread eyes catching the faint reflection of the room around it. Somewhere outside, the streets are busy, the world moving forward, and yet here the air is still as if waiting. Those who have stood before it and felt the quiet weight of its history know that the real question is not whether it could happen again, but whether we would notice before the sewing begins.